So in this video, I'm gonna show you how to install baseboard, basically foolproof methods to get a flawless finish every time. And we're gonna cover measuring, cutting, and installation, along with diagnosing and fixing common issues that come from installing over bad floors and walls. So before we move forward with the tutorial, the baseboard being installed is the WOBM004. And that is a 7-inch slick, beautiful profile made by Windsor 1, and you can find it at windsor1.com, and of course with a shoe. Anyway, let's cut some wood. So we're gonna measure for baseboard, one of the tape there, the other end here. So it's common to measure from the bottom because it keeps the measuring tape stable, but what it also does is it doesn't give you a true number. So right now this piece is as tight as it can get to the wall, okay? So if I was to cut this measurement at 131 1/4, which is giving me, it's gonna be too tight, especially if you're mitering. So what I do is I use a scrap block. Not only does it check the wall, but it gives me a true stop at where this piece is gonna stop at the wall. And this piece of scrap, I have it at 10 inches. So I can just measure up to here. So it's gonna be 121 1/8. So I add the 10 inches, it's 131 1/8. And that's what it's giving me here. So I do this so I don't have to keep basically traveling from the saw back and forth, and I can just cut a piece once and know it's gonna fit. I don't worry about this too much with coping because you can be a little bigger and the cope's still gonna snap in, but if you're mitering, I strongly suggest using a block for measuring. So now we're measuring this wall on the right side. We just measured this one. So this one butts up against casing, and again, I'm taking my measurement. If you're mitering, use a block to get that true measurement, but I'm not mitering, I'm coping. So one thing that I am going to check is, since this piece is a left piece and this piece is gonna get the outline cut so it can meet perfectly against this one, I am gonna butt two of them together like this when I'm taking the measurement for the cope side, which is this one, to check for any potential gaps. These gaps will happen at the bottom or the top, and we'll get into how to fix them. Same thing when you're measuring pieces that butt up against casing or a cabinet or what have you, is you take the measurement below and you got 115, and you write it down, right? You're measuring on the bottom. But then when you put your scrap, you have this extra 1/8 of an inch gap. So your true number is gonna be 115 1/8. So you can either write down that 115, and again, note on your notes that you gotta add this 1/8 of an inch to the top, or you can cut the entire thing at 115 1/8 and come in and adjust it, which I will show you how. Last scenario is measuring two exterior miters. So say you come in, you measure 55, you cut the piece at 55, you go to fit it, and it is short at the top by 1/4 inch. Again, this is just due to bad walls, floors, ceilings, you name it, right? A lot of these homes are older, they're not gonna be perfect. So what you would do is you measure, but then you put your scrap block. You notice that the top of the wall is sticking out 1/4 inch. So you take your 55 and add that 1/4 inch, making your true number, true measurement, 55 1/4. Last step when measuring to an exterior corner is we're gonna check the angle. They're not always going to be 90. So it's important to check this so you don't cut them at a 45 and you're left with a big gap at the back or front. So we're gonna check that. All right, cool. That's 44 1/2, so we can go 45. It's not a big deal, but it is important to check every exterior corner. So we're getting ready to cut the baseboard. Now, two things are going to happen with these taller baseboards. Is one, this channel is not going to allow the piece to sit completely flat against the fence because it's too tall for the fence. So the cut's going to be leaning back, so it's going to be off. And another thing is, well, let me show you. A lot of times it's not going to cut all the way through. Actually, most of the times it's not going to cut all the way through. So I'm going to show you one solution that takes care of both of those things. The solution is putting plywood over your fences and screwing them from behind. So this way, even with the channel, the piece can sit flat against the fence and it's not tilted like this. And also it pushes the material out just a little bit so it can clear a bigger radius of the blade, helping you cut all the way through. So let's see it in action. There you guys go. We have our total wall numbers from end to end, but we're coping, right? So do you account for the cope? What do? You still measure and cut your piece to this number. So on the left, I always cope my left side. We're gonna have a left miter that we're gonna cut out later. And then on the right side, we have a flat piece. So a flat cut like this. That doesn't change. You don't have to account for the cope, nothing. We're still gonna cut our miter, measure 131 1/4 and cut it flat. Ready to cut our miter. Now, generally I would just flip this piece upside down, line up my mark on my zero clearance, and get a precise cut. But if that's not an option, what I'm gonna do is something my buddy Gary Katz showed me, and that's creeping into the cut. And that's precisely moving the piece back and forth while keeping a safe distance. So say this is the mark I'm gonna cut right here. I'm gonna line up my blade just a little in front of it, and that's so I can creep into the cut. So how you creep into the cut is you keep your index finger against the fence. So if the piece was to pull you in, you have a stop right here, and you would just use your thumb to slide it back and forth. So that's what we're gonna do. We're gonna roughly line up the cut and creep into it. So again, we cut our left side, we got a miter. We're gonna hook onto that miter to the long point, and then come here and mark the 31 1/4 inside of the cut and cut that flat. Okay, so we have our mark at 131 1/4. Now we're gonna line it up with a zero clearance and cut. So we have this interior 45 corner. So what do we do with it? In layman's terms, we're gonna remove anything that isn't white, and it's gonna leave us with a cope. So a cope is basically an outline, and that allows you to have one of the pieces that go in the corner flat like this, and still get a nice, beautiful corner like this. And the beauty is that the wall doesn't have to be 90. It could be a couple degrees off each way. It could be a couple degrees off this way or that way. The floor could be off this way or that way, and you're still gonna get a nice tight fit with a cope. Now, let's try that with mitering. Mitering is still good, but you have to be really precise, because with a cope we can always round up and you're still gonna get a pressure fit, still gonna fit. With a miter, that's not gonna happen. If you're a little bigger, one of the pieces is gonna dig into the drywall like this. If you're a little smaller, obviously you're gonna be able to see that, and it's hard to shim it and adjust it. And also, if the floor is off, you gotta adjust for that. If the walls are off, you gotta account for that miter. So adjusting a cope is infinitely easier. So you guys just saw me cope using a jigsaw and a Collins cope foot. A Collins cope foot is a rounded base that replaces your flat base and allows you to steer and maneuver easier on complex cuts. I don't use a grinder because it's just way too dusty for me, and it can be dangerous if you're not paying attention. And a coping saw is still a great way to do coping, but sometimes I'll sit there and do 30 or 40 of these at once if it's a big job, and I can't do it by hand. It's just way too fatiguing. So that's why I prefer using the jigsaw. Anyway, with a lot of these moldings, if it's a flat piece like this that's this long, you can just flip it over after you miter and cut this with your miter saw at a nice back bevel. I tend not to make that a habit because I'm not always installing moldings by Windsor 1 that are stored properly. A lot of the times, some of the moldings that I deal with are going to be a little cupped, so I can have a nice straight cope like this, but when it meets the other piece, I'm going to be left with a gap at the top and bottom because of that belly. So now that we covered what coping is, this is still the 131 1/4 piece. So it had the miter, but we did the cope on it. So now let's go fit it. So we're getting ready to install this piece right here. But if you guys remember when we were measuring and we did the mock-ups, there was a little gap at the bottom. So I'm going to show you how to fix that right now. So this is the wall where we're going to install that long piece. But if you guys remember when we were measuring, we put our two little mock-ups and we noticed that there was a gap at the bottom. So that means that if I just fit this piece as is and just nail it, by the time I go to fit this piece, I'm going to be left with a big gap at the bottom. So say that the gap is 3/16. All we're going to do is take these pieces off and put a screw in the corner that sticks out 3/16. Just like that. Then we're going to put our piece back and check the fit. Boom, there you guys go. In other scenarios, say that you go to fit your mock-ups and you get a gap at the top. Again, we accounted for that gap, so we added the size of this gap, which is 3/16. We added 3/16 to our overall number. So then we come in with a cope, we fit it, we didn't change the angle or anything, and we're just gonna take the scribe to it, just like that. And then we're gonna cut this with the jigsaw. We're gonna take our piece and just cut it with a jigsaw. So we got it cut, so now let's go fit it. Last step before actually installing the pieces, I found one stud, and then I checked 16 to the left and then 16 to the right. I have studs there too. So I'm gonna write down this number, 43 3/4 from the right, and I'm gonna transfer this to my piece. Hook my measuring tape on the right side, come in, mark 43 3/4, and then move it to the nearest 16th mark. 16th marks are layouts for framing, and they're gonna be marked on red. So once I have it there, that means that I can come here, mark this one. I know I have a nail there. I know I have a nail there, and then come this way. So I got all my marks, and you can always just mark the 43 3/4, put the piece in there, and then lay your tape down on the floor and follow the red marks with your nail gun. I don't do it that way. I like making it a habit of marking the stud locations on the piece because of crown molding. If you do this on crown molding, it is a million times easier than trying to float your measuring tape. So we're ready to put this long piece in. We're gonna go cope first, right there. Get it as tight as we can, and we're gonna pop a nail in that corner. We roughly put our cope here. We're gonna pop a nail right on this bottom side here. And it might look a little open, but once we snap the other side in place, we're gonna come back and check it out. We fit the cope on that end. Now we're gonna fit this other end. This is really simple. One hand is pushing out and the other one is pushing in, and that's for snap copes. Alrighty, now for the fun part. There you go. All right, so we pressure fitted the piece. Now coming back to check on the left cope. As you can see, there's no caulking or anything. It just closed right up, and it looks as tight as it can get now. So yeah, let's get this piece nailed. To push these in and nail it on my marks, I'm using a 16 gauge nailer, and I'm gonna go bottom plate and cleat it into the stud. Okay, so we're getting ready to install this piece. If you guys remember, that is the corner that we adjusted, so we know that the cope there is going to fit. But now coming up to here, we could have cut the angle when we put our mock-up and notice any gaps. We could have cut that angle, but I left it a little long so I can show you guys how to field adjust really quickly. So to field adjust, I'm just gonna make sure that my left side is tight, and I'm just gonna take what's called a preacher block. This is a block with the height of the baseboard, and then the thickness of the casing and the baseboard cut out. And that's so I can put it right next to it. It's gonna be tight up here all the way to the top, and then I can just mark the top and the bottom. And this way, when I cut it, it's gonna meet with the casing perfectly. But as you can tell right away, we have an 1/8 at the top and almost nothing at the bottom. So let's go get this cut. So to cut this piece, I have two different marks. I have the mark at the top and the mark at the bottom. So I'm gonna line up this top mark on the seam right here. That's the seam between the metal and the insert. So I'm gonna line that up right where those meet. And then I'm gonna swivel the miter, the seam again, to where it meets the mark at the bottom. So it's just slight, but I'm gonna lock it in. Come in close, line it up with my zero clearance, and cut. All right, so we got it cut. Now let's fit the cope like that, and now this side. Alrighty, no visible gaps. Now let's go check the cope. Cope looks great as well. Okay, so now let's talk exterior miters. Now, again, we took our measurement, put a scrap to account for any indifferences in the wall, and also took the angle of this wall because it's not always 90. So we took that so we can cut our miters to the correct angle so they can fit nice and tight like this. And again, that's because your wall's not always gonna be 90, so you gotta cut the 45, and it's a 94-degree wall. You're gonna get an open miter, and then you gotta fill it in and do all that. One thing to note is, say that you used your scrap, but for some reason you're getting a gap at this bottom, right? So what you would do, the beauty about moldings is that they have this channel. So you would just run this through the table saw, or just run a foot down with a jigsaw, to basically flatten up the piece so it can meet a little nicer with the bottom. And you could do that for the top as well. All right, so now to glue and clamp, threw a little glue on the miter on this one as well. So we're going to fit it like that and then clamp it. And the reason why we are clamping is because it allows it to stay tight during moisture changes, and also anybody coming around a corner kicking it, you don't want that miter falling apart. So if you don't have these called miter clamps, basically what you can also do is just glue it up, let it sit like a minute, and then pop some nails in it. It can be a little tricky and they can slip and slide, not allowing you to get a tight corner, but that also does the trick if you don't have miter clamps. So say we got a wall at 20 feet, that means we got to join two pieces together. Your first instinct would be to miter them so they can meet this way. But here are some issues with this, is that with moisture changes, even if you were to get a really good glue up, these are going to slip and slide all over the place. That's why any home you walk into that's got this type of joint, you can see the seam immediately. And also they are impossible to line up. A much better joint, in my opinion, is going to be 2 straight cuts with dowels in between. So this basically is not going to allow the pieces to slip and slide like a miter would, and we're coping so we can pressure fit this. So even if we get a slight gap, once you snap those pieces into place, this is going to tighten up, giving the glue the proper pressure to work efficiently. So obviously you don't want to pressure fit these if you're mitering, and if you're mitering, you can still use this method. Just throw some pinch dogs in between, and that's going to clamp up this joint. But in my opinion, this joint is going to look better. It's easier to sand and finish. It's a lot more durable, and it's just easier to install. So as long as you get a method to throw those dowels in perfectly, which I will eventually show a video, this is the best method for joining two pieces together. So now we're getting ready to do the shoe molding. I don't want to spend a lot of time with the shoe molding, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut that piece that goes along that way flat, this piece flat. Sorry, I don't know what's going on with my hands. And I'm just going to measure this one, cut it, and do a double cope. So we have 129 3/4. So I'm going to cut a miter on both sides and cope it. So for that 129 3/4, I'm just going to cut a miter on the right side, hook it to this miter right here, and mark the left. All right, so we got it hooked on the right side. Now we're marking the left 129 3/4. So we're going to cut this miter real quick. Now we're just going to cut it and cope it. On to coping shoe molding. Still going to use a jigsaw, probably just as quick with a coping saw, just shoe molding. But I'm going to make a relief cut down the middle and then carve out the rest. And even if there's a little residue, I'm going to show you a cool trick to clean it up super quick. All right, I didn't get as much residue, but if you do have a lot, I'm going to take a piece of scrap shoe molding, wrap it around some sandpaper, and just file away that way. Get the perfect profile. So only works in single cut profiles, so shoe molding would be a perfect example. But anyway, so now with my middle piece cut, all I gotta do is cut that one and that one flat. No reason to go to the miter, so I'm just gonna use some scissors. So this one is 154 and this one is 114.5. Super quick, got both of them marked. Again, no reason to go back to the miter saw, and I'm just gonna trim them with the... All right, again, we cut those flat ends and they're gonna be a little tight, but just gotta pressure fit them. And you're good. Even if you got a slight gap there, no worries, the cope's gonna cover that up. Now for the right side, same thing, flat, and just gonna pressure fit it in and nail it. So now fitting our double cope, got the cope on the left, shot a nail. Now let's go to the right and shoot a nail there. All right, so now we got the cope on the right. We're just gonna put a nail there. And again, it's very important to shoot into the bottom plate, not into the floor. Okay, so now with that there, we can push this in and it's gonna tighten up the copes on both ends. So that about sums it up for the baseboard installation. Hopefully you guys learned something new. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. And again, this profile is by Windsor 1 and the link to it is in the description. And next set of videos, we're gonna cover crown molding. So I will see you then. Take care.